We'll transition now over to Ben Wachendorf and his presentation on the current event tragedy of OceanGate. Retired Rear Admiral Ben Wachendorf, a friend, colleague, and executive advisor at SMA, will share his thoughts. Please type any questions you have into the chat, and we'll do our best at the end of his presentation to address those. So now over to Ben for his thoughts. Ben?
Hey, thanks, Chuck. You hear me all right?
Yes.
Good. I didn't expect to be joining you so soon after my recent talk a couple of weeks ago, but the events, like Chuck described, have an opportunity to give some insight here. Whereas before I talked about a lot of the things I did in the submarine service, what I'm going to talk about today will focus on my tour as a Commodore or squadron commander of sort of the cats and dogs of the submarine force, which included all the deep submergence programs that the Navy had. The tragedy that Chuck referred to and sadly lost 5 people has, I'd just like to mention, maybe overshadowed a greater tragedy in my view when 500 plus people were lost at the same time, migrants in the Mediterranean. And the point here being the sea can be a very unforgiving place. So sorry for both of those tragedies. Getting back to the OceanGate story, the vessel that imploded and is now being recovered, or mostly has been, I guess, by now, was diving on the wreck of the Titanic. I'd like to go into just a little bit of history of the Titanic because I had some interaction with that. In 1985, a Woods Hole Navy-funded expedition under the leadership of Dr. Bob Ballard used what's called an ROV, which stands for Remotely Operated Vehicle. This is a tethered, unmanned craft that went down in the area of Titanic and made the initial discovery of Titanic. If you watch the National Geographic video of this, that's not really how it happened, because Dr. Ballard was asleep when the ship was found, and a petty officer who worked for me was on watch with the sonar system and found the whole thing. And then they had to wake him up and make it sound like he had some good ideas of where the ship might be when they knew exactly where it was. Just a small point. They then followed that up with a manned submersible, and that was Alvin, and took a lot of video and that kind of thing. Before I get into more of the science here, I'd just like to point out that sonar is a much better search tool than anything visual. The turbidity of the water will affect how far you can see underwater, but it's almost always in double-digit feet or less, whereas sonar can go a very long way, and at high frequency has very high resolution. But it's visual that gets all the screen time, so that's what people want to do, and I guess that's what these people were trying to do before the ship imploded. Moving forward in time, in about 2010, no, maybe 11, I met the CEO of OceanGate, the gentleman who perished on board. His name was Stockton Rush. He came from the Ford Motor Corporation, was passionate about undersea exploration. He really ran his business not to make money. Matter of fact, I think he lost money on most of his dives. His original project was funded by the University of Washington Applied Physics Lab. And what made his approach unique was traditional deep submersibles use very either thick or strong or both steel or titanium, more commonly titanium for the real deep divers. Titanium is a metal that is very strong, but it's also very difficult to weld. And for decades, the Russians were much better at welding thicknesses of titanium than we were. We could do it in airplanes pretty well, but they put a lot of emphasis on that and made some entire submarine classes out of titanium, very expensive. But in any case, because of that expense, what Stockton Rush was trying to do was to make a affordable, if you call $250,000 a ride, affordable opportunity for tourists, if you will, to go to the ocean bottom. And the way he did that was to use carbon fiber as the primary strength member of his craft. If you play tennis or golf, you're probably familiar with the product in different formats, but you have to understand that the pressure that vessel is subject to is enormous. At 12,500 feet, the pounds per square inch pressure of the water is about 5,500 pounds. And at the front of that vessel, if you've seen pictures of it on TV or the papers, it had a viewing window. It was about 18 inches in diameter. And I did some back of the envelope math. The force on that transparent window was over 1.5 million pounds. That's 750 tons. I also noted when they recovered it, it was open because when a vessel implodes, it's enormous forces come to play when water collides at very high speed, and it's non-compressible, so shock is very large, and sadly that's what happened there. I have no insight into how or why it failed. I was interviewed by Mr. Rush to join his team. I declined because I had concerns about the inspections and safety standards. And again, I'm very sorry for the people who lost their lives there. I would also point out that I think just earlier today, when you get into this very expensive tourism in high-risk environments, the Virgin Galactic made a launch for the first time in several months. They've done it before. And this involved a plane taking off from New Mexico, going to 40,000 feet and shooting a smaller vehicle with tourists on board and pilots up into the fringe of space. I think distance is about 50 miles. And then they made it back to Earth. Coincidentally, I saw the price of that ticket was also about 250,000. But I believe they've sold over 800 tickets. So there's a big backlog of people who want to do this. What people with a lot of money want to do with it is not my concern, but I would point out that, in my opinion anyway, if it's just science and not entertainment, unmanned vehicles do a whole lot more at much less cost with no risk as compared to manned vehicles. That's true in space. Look at what we've done on the surface of Mars and other places. And it's also true underwater. I'll go into a little more detail of the underwater thing, but before I leave the space environment, I'm not trying to throw anybody under the bus here. I'm very proud of an ensign who worked for me on my ship that I commanded, who was a straight stick nuclear submarine officer, did everything he was required to do in his first tour, qualified engineering officer of the watch, qualified officer of the deck, passed the exam to be a chief engineer on a Navy nuclear power plant. But then he decided he wanted to transfer to the space program. And as a Navy officer, he was the first submariner to go to space. He made 3 space shuttle missions. And as we sit here today, he's the mission commander on board the International Space Station, which is in orbit right now. So it's up there for about 6 months. And I point that out because SpaceX just flew 5 tourists up there for a week in space. That's an orbital mission all the way to the space station. So something to think about, I guess. Anyway, getting back to the undersea kind of things and hazards, I mentioned the pressure. One of the challenges here is that in a manned submersible, we maintain the pressure inside about 1 atmosphere. And so you have to have atmospheric control equipment of some sort to provide metabolic oxygen and clean up carbon dioxide. And that's not too hard. But there's no light at the bottom of the ocean. So if visual is the objective, you've got to have lights to illuminate whatever it is you're looking at. You also have to have what we call thrusters or motors that are usually trainable or some other kind of device to maneuver, turn, twist, move, make the manned submersible go up or down. And for all of these, they're powered by batteries that are at the 1 atmosphere point. And so they have to have penetrations for command and control that go through the pressure hull to the exterior environment where these lights and motors and maybe sonar or other manipulators or those kind of things are all located. And each one of those holes is a significant quality control potential risk. I point that out because, and I'm not trying to repeat what I've said before, I was CO of a submarine that got cut in half and made 100 feet longer. And just in the 100-foot section, there were 1,200 new holes through the pressure hull. That's more than in original equipment when the submarine was built in one piece. And you can test the pipes inside the ship, and you can test up to the isolation valve near the pressure hull, but there's no way to hydrostatically test the weld of where the pipe goes through the pressure hull. 1,200 of them in that case. Needless to say, we went to test depth the first time, and there weren't a lot of people sleeping that night. Okay, maybe I'll just pause here and do a small show and tell. I was asked to show some stuff from before. This is a Navy ball cap. This was one of the units under my command. It's called the Unmanned Vehicles Detachment. This is a ball cap for deep submergence vehicle Turtle. Turtle, it has a 10K, if you can really get in on it. Was a 10,000-foot Navy submersible that was assigned to my command. Let's see. This was Seacliff, which is another manned submersible down to 20,000 feet. That covers 98% of the ocean bottom. Marianas Trench is deeper, but places like that are not very common. A couple of Hollywood things here. If you saw the movie Hunt for Red October, they use what's called a DSRV. That's a deep submergent rescue vehicle. We don't have those anymore, but we did then, and they were assigned to my command. We had two of them. One was Mystic, and the other was Avalon, and they were used in that movie. One last, two things to show. This used to be a 24-ounce styrofoam cup. It was given to me by the last diesel submarine in our Navy called Dolphin. It was a research submarine that could go down to 5,000 feet. And they put a bunch of these in the signal ejector. And as it went down, all the air, which is what keeps the fluid or milkshake or whatever you're drinking cold, pops. And this is a very hard plastic. It used to be 24 ounces. And I guess a final show and tell that pulled off the I Love Me wall is this is my certificate of being a certified saturation diver, which allows operations down to 850 feet. Now, interesting thing, going back to space again, saturation divers use mixed gas because of the bends and all. And if a diver at 850 feet needs medical attention, we could get an astronaut back from the surface of the moon to Earth faster than we could get a diver up from 850 feet to the surface. So if there's a medical emergency, we press the doctor down. We don't bring the diver up. It just takes a long time because of the bends. Let's see. I'm getting a bunch of questions, I think. Maybe I ought to just try to answer those. Chuck, could you want to read those questions? I'll try to answer them.
Sure, Ben. The first one has to do with the dissimilar metals that were used in Ocean View. The titanium, the carbon fibers have been discussed as a potential cause of the failure due to the different properties. Can you comment on that?
I don't have direct insight. Delamination of the carbon fiber is under cyclical stress, I think, going to be found to be a factor. I'm not I'm a Navy nuclear engineer, which is just about a little bit of every kind of engineering there is, from chemical to electrical to mechanical, heat transfer, fluid flow, but I'm not deep in any of those. At the risk of speaking up, being thought dumb, and what is that thing? It's better to be silent and be thought dumb than speak up and remove all doubt. I'll tell what little I know about aeronautical engineering, in that I'm familiar from a resource sponsorship that aircraft like the F-18 had to be rebarreled. There's a center core barrel of that airplane that takes the big load when it pulls high G maneuvers, and it has a service life. It can only do so many of those for so long, and then it has to be replaced. Similarly, there's a significant and very expensive for the American taxpayer decision being made about our future strategic missile submarine force. Those ships are nearing end of life, where they were evaluated to be no longer capable of experiencing cyclical stress. So we know a lot about metals and how the stress strain yield curves and things. And again, in metals, you can do x-rays and non-destructive testing and other things to help at critical points reduce risk. For carbon graphite, no, you can't. And you're right, there's always some titanium there, but I think this vessel had gone to those depths more than 30 times, I believe. And each time it gets squeezed and then released. My guess is the scientists, engineers will look at that as a possible cause, but that's all I know.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you, Ben. One of the other things is it's kind of an odd use of carbon fiber in a compression. It's typically used in the opposite. It likes to be in tension, and that's how it's generally used. So it was a kind of an unusual use of that. And like you said, it's almost impossible to really do any quality assurance on composites. We're still struggling with that. The next question has to do with the shape. A lot of people have commented about that as well, where typically, these deep diving they're sears or they're cylinders with end caps as we know them. Can you comment on the shape of this? And
yes, despite what it looked like on the outside, the actual pressure vessel itself was a cylinder with two hemisphere heads for engineering reasons. It didn't look like that in the outside, but that is just places of free flooding environments that held machinery or cables or things like that.
Yeah, think of the old fleet boats were sort of the same way, right? As they had all the bearings out on the outside. Yeah. One of the other questions had to do with when you get an implosion like this, does it generate intense heat? And what likely killed the people?
No, I think in less than a second, they felt shock of these tons of seawater, F equals MA, basically, just colliding and very destructive. I am familiar with torpedoes, and the fuel flask of a 21-inch torpedo, if it were to implode, could have the explosive force of 1,000 pounds of TNT.
Wow.
As a comparison. And this was a much bigger volume than 21 inches.
Right. Hey, there's another question, because people did notice all of the deep diving vehicles that came under you, Ben. And one of the questions is, why don't we still have those?
Because robots are so much cheaper is the primary reason. And these manned ones are very expensive. And the other reason is the Navy has outsourced this. The oil and gas industry, which was fledgling in the 70s and 80s, is, as many of you know, thriving in many parts of the world in maritime environments. And they have a huge demand for remotely operated vehicles and things, so that we have leveraged commercial technology, and that's what we use primarily for search and submarine rescue today.
Right. And that's pretty much it for the questions. And anyone else want to add anything to the chat?
Well, while they're thinking that, let me tell at least one more story that might be of interest. In 1968, there were 4 submarines that sank. One of them was USS Scorpion. We don't talk much about that for a number of reasons. One of them was K-129, which was a Russian Gulf-class submarine that sank off of Hawaii. Lots been talked about that because Howard Hughes and Ross Perot and others got together with the CIA and built a single-purpose ship called Glomar Explorer, which recovered parts of that submarine, got it to near 200 feet and broke apart. And this was all highly classified until one of the people I talked about 2 weeks ago was Robert Gates, the CIA director. In 1991, I believe, he went to Moscow and gave the Russian president a videotape of what they recovered from that submarine that included 6 human remains. And they gave a formal burial at sea, playing the Russian anthem and everything else. It's just one of those Cold War stories. There was a French submarine named Minerve that sank off of Toulon, wasn't found for 35 years. But the one I'm going to talk about is an Israeli submarine called Dakar. Dakar was a modified British T-class submarine. The British cut it in half, made it longer, sort of like the one I was on, not as big, and it was diesel powered. They finished their sea trials and were transiting back to Israel. The CO wanted to set the speed record for a diesel submarine transit of the Med and come into port a day early. That request was denied, and that was the last they ever heard from the ship. That was in 1968. A lot going on in the Med, 67, 68, 73. But enough of that. In 1998, 30 years later, the Israeli government made a request to the United States Navy to find Dakar. And that fell to me. I went to Israel to discuss what intelligence there was and what we knew about the ship and where it was operating. The Israeli CNO met me on a commercial flight, plainside. I bypassed all the immigration and everything else. I really got the red carpet treatment. I never had that before. I was impressed. Turns out Dakar was on what we call a 24-hour broadcast schedule. So every 24 hours, she established radio contact and set her position. But to make a long story short, the search area for that ship was the size of the state of Connecticut. And we used unmanned vehicles for many months and found it. It was in about 8,000 feet of water. And when I talked to the CNO, he said, well, I said, why are we going after this 30 years later? And he said, it's important to our religion that we have a religious closure of the people who lost their lives there. I said, I'm sorry about that, but you understand 30 years later, there are not going to be any remains that you can recover under any condition for that purpose. And he didn't say anything. And then I said, now, when we come up with our search plan, we need to know the size of what it is we're looking for. And we have to probably assume that the ship imploded and broke apart into small pieces, which means we have to have higher frequency sonars. And when we tow a vehicle, we have to be a certain altitude off the bottom to see all that. And he said, no, we think it's intact. And I said, Admiral, the water depth here is over 5,000 feet. There's no way a submarine is going to be intact at 5,000 feet. He said, because when a submarine has a fire or flooding, the first thing submariners do is shut doors and bulkhead flappers and seal things up to try to contain the damage. And that creates air pockets. And when the ship sinks, they're going to implode, just like we saw, what we were discussing earlier. They said, no, we have reason to believe the ship's intact. I said, well, the only way it could be intact is if the whole ship was flooded before any implosion took that. And he said, yeah, that's what we think happened. And he said, there might have been an act of sabotage. Oh, all of a sudden alarm bells go off in my head. How the hell is that going to happen? and what about the crew and everything else? Well, I didn't say anything. And in fact, when we found it, it was in pieces. And then the Israelis were very anxious to have us leave the scene, turn off all the cameras, go away. Thank you very much. And they were paying for this. Well, it's probably US FMS sellers that paid for the damn thing anyway. But my point in this is, if you search DAKAR on the internet, and I'm not confirming or denying anything, there are stories about what really happened to that ship. And one of them is that it had nuclear weapons on board that were being transferred from England to Israel, which is possibly one of the reasons why, as undersea technology in the 90s was advancing, the Israelis wanted to either recover those weapons or whatever. I'm not saying that's just what you can see on the internet. I thought you might find that interesting. I was told we had as many as 45 minutes, but unless you're up for a sea story, I think that's probably it for me, unless there's any other questions.
There was one more, Ben,
Yeah.
and it was specifically about what were your concerns over OceanGate and why you kind of walked away from them and didn't join them.
They were in uncharted territory with technology. We're all products of our environment. I'm a Navy nuclear submarine guy. Rest of the Navy makes fun about us. It says, you know, we can't screw in a light bulb without a written procedure and a bunch of other stuff, but we are very risk adverse. I've spent a lot of time around nuclear weapons, nuclear reactors, deep submergence programs. Safety is always up front in everything we do. I'm not saying other people don't care about safety, but that was my background. So the reason, short answer is, it was, I didn't think it was safe. And I didn't think they had
well-founded and wise
culture to manage that.
Right. Yeah. Well, it was a good thing you did, Ben. It was the right thing to do. Well, thanks for joining us, all of you, and thanks, Ben, for this important talk on safety. We certainly offer our condolences to the victims and the families.